morning, Faith Family, and welcome to the Daily Connection, a time where we get together in the Word, and more importantly, we try to get the Word into us. So this week, our topic is the death of Jesus. And as you might imagine, that's going to be kind of a good flow out of what we talked about last week with James dealing with our sin, our condition of sin. And so today, we're looking specifically at verses 6 and 7 of Romans chapter 6, which say, "For we know that our old self was crucified with him, so that the body ruled by sin might be rendered powerless, so that we may no longer be enslaved to sin, since the person who has died is freed from sin." I was reading those verses. It reminded me of an analogy I heard one time where in India, they often will try to get an elephant when he's really, really young, when that elephant's real young, not near as powerful as a full-grown adult. And they'll take that elephant and they'll attach it by a big rope to a stake that's driven far enough in the ground it can hold that young elephant. Well, as the elephant grows and they continue to attach it, it just becomes accustomed to being held back by or captured, if you want to think of it that way, by the stake, the rope connected to the stake. It can't move it. It can't lodge itself free from, can't get free from it. And so naturally, its mind eventually becomes convinced that it's enslaved to the string, the rope and the stake. Well, they know, the handlers know that as this elephant grows into a full-grown adult, there's no way that that stake is going to hold that elephant. But because the elephant's become conditioned from an early age that the stake can hold it, when it becomes an adult and they fasten the string to the adult's leg, it naturally doesn't try to fight it because in its mind it's already convinced it can't conquer it. Well, we're born with a sin nature, and as we grow, that sin nature shows itself in so many ways, and eventually we're convinced that we're helpless to overcome that sin nature. There's nothing we can do, and of course we know that in essence that's really true. There's nothing we can do in and of ourselves to overcome that. But the death of Christ has given us victory for those who have confessed Christ as Lord and they're following Him faithfully. His death has now given us the power to overcome them. That's the reason why Paul says in verse 6, we know that our old self was crucified with Him, so that the body ruled by sin might be rendered powerless. Those are great statements right there. First of all, he says, we know. So it's like he's saying, hey, as a matter of fact, he's stating it as a completed act. He said, we know this to be true, that our old self was crucified with Him. That word old self doesn't necessarily mean old in terms of chronology. It means more the idea of being worn out, no longer good for anything, dilapidated, if you will. He's saying, hey, that old nature, that old self, it was crucified with Christ, so that the body ruled by sin might be rendered powerless. Some translations say done away with, but rendered powerless really is the right idea here. It's the idea of being inept, unable to overcome. So that because our new nature is rooted in the completed work of Christ as it empowered by the Holy Spirit in us, then the old nature no longer has any power because that nature is dilapidated. It's done away. It's gone. Now, as James pointed out last week, that doesn't mean that Satan won't still try in various ways to tempt us to sin. He won't try in various ways to lure us in by our old passions, our old desires that were rooted in lust and unhealthy attractions and desires for. And that's not true, but we now know that when we are tempted, when Satan does try to bring us back under the power of sin and in bondage to sin, he doesn't have a leg to stand on. He doesn't have a foothold because that old nature, according to Romans 6, verse 6, is dilapidated, it's done away, it's crucified, it's dead, it's no longer effective. Hey, he says, we know that the person who has been died with Christ is no longer enslaved to sin. And we need to live like that. We need to live with that knowledge. We need to live with that conviction, that confidence that we don't have to submit to the sinful desires that might still try to show up, or that will still try to show up. Like that adult elephant, we don't need to be confused. We don't need to be convinced by or coerced by Satan that we're still attached to his stake. We're still attached to the stake of the sinful desires. Instead, we need to understand the power that is within us as a result of having been crucified with Christ, following Him in death, exemplified by our baptism, buried, raised. We don't have to be a slave to sin anymore. Since, Paul says in verse 7, the person who has died is freed from sin. We're freed from its power. We're freed from the lustful desires that it can tries to garner within us, and we're certainly freed from the penalty for that sin because we have now received his grace through faith. Well, I hope today is an encouragement to you. I hope it's a challenge to you. As that young elephant, at one point we were susceptible to, we were being hoodwinked, if you will, by Satan, that we were absolutely powerless to break free. But we need to know that when Christ died and we, accepted his gift of salvation and we surrendered our life to his lordship, that bondage was broke, that the stake was pulled up, that the string was cut. And we're no longer in bondage, we're no longer slaves to his sin. We are children of God, and we have the power of the Holy Spirit. So walk in the power of the Spirit today so that you won't seek to fulfill the desires of the flesh, but yet we will desire righteousness. And in all things, wherever you're headed, whatever you're going to be doing, remember, as always, live sin.